When Airman First Class Rebecca Becca Walsh walked into the communications squadron at Nellis Air Force Base, she looked exactly like what she was. A small-town girl from Nebraska who'd never been more than 50 miles from home before enlisting. At 5'3", with mousy brown hair always pulled back in regulation but somehow still messy, thick-rimmed glasses, and a habit of ducking her head when spoken to, she was easy to overlook. Master Sergeant Derek Coleman noticed her immediately, but not in a good way. "What did they send us? A high school intern?" he muttered to Staff Sergeant Mike Torres as Becca fumbled with her duffel bag, trying to report for duty while juggling her paperwork. The other airman snickered. Coleman ran the communications shop like his personal kingdom. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with 22 years of service and a voice that could carry across the flight line, he commanded respect through intimidation. His uniform was always perfect, his desk organized with military precision, and his expectations impossibly high, especially for anyone he deemed weak. Becca's first week was brutal. Coleman assigned her to inventory duty, counting and recounting thousands of cables, connectors, and spare parts in the sweltering Nevada heat of the equipment warehouse. When she finished early and asked for additional tasks, he'd bark, "Did I tell you to think? Just do what you're told, Walsh." The breaking point came during her second week. Becca had spent 3 days meticulously organizing the warehouse's chaotic storage system, creating a detailed catalog that would save hours of searching time. She'd worked through lunch and stayed late, driven by the simple desire to be useful. "Sergeant Coleman," she said quietly, approaching his desk with her handwritten charts, "I finished the inventory and created a new organization system. I think it might help?" "I think," Coleman interrupted loudly, his voice echoing through the communications center, "that new airmen should shut up and color. Nobody asked for your improvements, Walsh. In fact," he stood up, towering over her, "since you've got so much extra time to play office organizer, maybe you need more work." He grabbed her carefully organized charts and dropped them in the trash can. The room fell silent except for the hum of radio equipment. "Start over, all of it, and this time, do exactly what I told you. Nothing more, nothing less." Becca's face burned red, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, Sergeant." As she walked back to the warehouse, she heard Torres whisper to another airman, "Damn, that was cold, even for Coleman." But nobody said anything to her directly. Nobody wanted to risk becoming Coleman's next target. That night, in her dorm room, Becca sat on her narrow bed and stared at her hands. They were calloused now from handling equipment, with small cuts, from metal edges and cable ties. Back home, her mom always said she was too sensitive for the military, that she'd never make it through basic training, let alone succeed as an airman. Maybe they were all right. Maybe she really was just a small-town girl playing dress-up in someone else's uniform. But as she looked around her sparse room, at her perfectly made bed, her textbooks on communication systems, her handwritten study notes, something hardened inside her chest. She'd worked too hard to get here. She'd endured too much to quit now. Coleman might think he could break her with humiliation and extra work. He was wrong. She just had to figure out how to prove it. The harassment escalated over the following weeks. Coleman seemed to take personal pleasure in making Becca's life miserable. He'd assign her to the worst details: cleaning grease traps, scrubbing radio equipment in the motor pool, organizing storage areas that hadn't been touched in years. When she completed tasks efficiently, he'd find fault with imaginary problems. "Walsh, this connector inventory is garbage," he'd announce in front of the whole shop, even when her work was flawless. "Do it again, and this time, try to remember you're in the Air Force, not summer camp." The worst part wasn't the extra work or the public humiliation. It was the isolation. The other airmen weren't cruel, but they weren't stupid either. Associating with Coleman's target was social suicide. They'd nod politely when she walked by, but conversations died when she approached. Except for senior airman Jessica Martinez. Jess was one of the shop's senior communications technicians, a quiet professional, who'd been at Nellis for 3 years. She had dark hair, intelligent eyes, and a reputation for being unflappable under pressure. While others avoided Becca, Jess began offering small gestures of solidarity. "Hey, Walsh," she said one afternoon as Becca struggled with a particularly heavy box of equipment. "Need a hand?" "I've got it," Becca replied automatically, not wanting to burden anyone else with Coleman's wrath. "I'm sure you do, but 4 hands are better than 2. Jess grabbed one end of the box without waiting for permission. Besides, Coleman's in a meeting with the squadron commander. He won't be back for 20 minutes. As they carried the equipment together, Jess spoke quietly. "You know, your warehouse organization system was actually brilliant. I grabbed copies of your charts before Coleman trashed them." Becca nearly dropped her end of the box. "You did?" "Someone had to. That system would save us hours every week. I've been thinking about implementing it on the night shift when Coleman's not around." Jess paused. "You shouldn't let him convince you that. You're not good at this job, Walsh. I've been watching you work. You're detail-oriented, you learn fast, and you actually give a damn. That's more than I can say for half the people in this shop." For the first time since arriving at Nellis, Becca felt a spark of hope. Maybe she wasn't completely alone after all, but Coleman wasn't finished with her. The next week he began a new tactic, sabotage disguised as mentorship. "Walsh," he called out during the morning briefing, "you're on radio maintenance today. Work with Airman Peterson on the base communication systems." Radio maintenance was complex, requiring careful attention to frequency settings and signal calibration. One mistake could disrupt communications across the base. Becca had been studying the technical manuals for weeks, but she'd never worked on the actual equipment. Peterson, a cocky second-year airman who worshipped Coleman, smirked as they walked to the radio room. "Hope you know what you're doing, college girl. These aren't textbook exercises." For 4 hours, Becca worked methodically through the maintenance checklist while Peterson supervised, which mostly meant texting on his phone and making unhelpful comments. When they finished, everything seemed to be working correctly. The next morning, the base communication system crashed during a critical training exercise. Within hours, word spread that the failure was traced to incorrectly calibrated radio equipment that Becca had worked on the day before. Coleman's voice boomed across the communications center. "Walsh, my office, now." As she walked toward his desk, Becca's mind raced. She was certain she'd followed the procedures correctly. She double-checked every setting, documented every adjustment. But Peterson had been there too, and his word would carry more weight than hers. Coleman slammed an incident report on his desk. "Explain this, Airman." Becca read the report, her heart sinking. According to Peterson's statement, she had rushed through procedures and ignored his guidance during the radio maintenance. The failure looked like her fault entirely. "Sergeant Coleman, I followed the technical manual exactly. I have my notes." "Your notes?" Coleman's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your notes don't matter when the whole base loses communications because you can't follow simple instructions. This is exactly what I warned everyone about when you got here. You're not ready for real responsibility." Becca felt the walls closing. "I'm in one more incident like this, and she could face formal disciplinary action, or worse, discharge from the Air Force. Her dreams of proving herself, of building a career, were crumbling. But as she stood there, something nagged at her. Peterson's account didn't match her memory of the day, and the specific equipment failure seemed almost too convenient. She was starting to suspect this wasn't incompetence. It was warfare. The radio incident followed Becca like a shadow. Word spread quickly through the base. The new girl had screwed up a critical communication system. Other shops began requesting different technicians when they needed communication support. Coleman made sure everyone knew about her failure during daily briefings. "This is why we have standards," he'd say, looking directly at her. "One careless mistake can compromise an entire mission." Becca threw herself into studying, determined to prove her competence. She spent evenings in the technical library, memorizing equipment manuals and communication protocols. She practiced procedures until she could perform them flawlessly, but the damage was done. Nobody trusted her anymore. The situation reached a breaking point 3 weeks later during a major training exercise. Thunderstorm 24 was a multi-base communication drill designed to test emergency response protocols. The entire communication squadron would be working 12-hour shifts to maintain contact between Nellis and 5 other installations across the southwest. Coleman assigned Becca to the overnight shift, the skeleton crew that monitored systems while most personnel slept. It should have been straightforward. Watch the status boards, respond to routine check-ins, and alert supervisors if anything went wrong. At 2:47 a.m., everything went wrong. Becca was alone in the communications center when the primary satellite link to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base went down. Standard protocol required immediately switching to backup systems and notifying the shift supervisor. But when she tried to activate the backup link, nothing happened. Her heart pounding, she ran through the emergency checklist. Primary satellite, offline. Backup satellite, offline. Landline backup, offline. Radio backup, offline. Davis-Monthan was completely cut off from the exercise network. This couldn't be a coincidence. Multiple independent systems didn't fail simultaneously. Unless something was seriously wrong, or unless someone wanted them to fail. Becca's hands shook as she reached for the emergency phone to call Coleman. Then she stopped. Something made her look more carefully at the equipment status panels. The backup systems weren't malfunctioning. They'd been manually disabled. Someone had deliberately switched them off and made it look like equipment failure. The settings were wrong in ways that would be subtle to a casual observer, but obvious to someone who really understood the systems. Her mind raced. The exercise was being monitored by inspectors from Air Combat Command. A communications failure this significant would trigger a formal investigation. If Davis-Monthan remained offline for more than 15 minutes, the entire exercise would be compromised, and guess who was on duty when it happened? The airmen who'd already been blamed for one major communications failure. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Coleman was trying to destroy her career completely. Becca looked at the clock. 2:52 a.m. She had maybe 10 minutes before someone noticed Davis-Monthan's absence from the exercise network. 10 minutes to decide between calling for help and admitting defeat, or trying to fix this herself and risking even more blame if she failed. She thought about her parents back in Nebraska, who'd been so proud when she enlisted. She thought about Jess Martinez, who'd believed in her when no one else would. She thought about all the other airmen like her, quiet, underestimated people, who just wanted to serve their country competently. Coleman had crossed a line. He wasn't just bullying her anymore. He was sabotaging military operations to settle a personal vendetta. People could get hurt. Careers could be destroyed. The mission could fail. She couldn't let that happen. Becca took a deep breath, pushed up her glasses, and got to work. Her fingers flew over the control panels, methodically re-enabling each backup system. Primary satellite to Davis-Monthan. Still offline. Probably a legitimate equipment failure. But the backup systems came online one by one as she corrected the deliberate misconfigurations. At 2:58 a.m., communication with Davis-Monthan was restored through the secondary satellite link. At 2:59 a.m., Becca began documenting everything. She photographed the equipment panels showing the original incorrect settings. She printed the system, logs showing exactly when each backup had been disabled, and noted that all the changes had been made during the previous day's shift when Coleman had access to the equipment. By 3:15 a.m., she had a file full of evidence that would prove the communications failure had been deliberate sabotage, but she also knew that presenting this evidence would be tantamount to accusing a senior NCO of deliberately compromising military operations. Without absolute proof, it would be her word against Coleman's, and she was just a first-year airman with one black mark already on her record. As she sat in the humming communications center, surrounded by blinking lights and radio chatter from the ongoing exercise, Becca realized she'd reached a crossroads. She could file her evidence and hope someone would listen, or she could keep quiet and let Coleman continue his campaign of harassment. Either way, there was no going back. She made her choice. The next morning, Becca didn't report the communications incident to Coleman. Instead, she quietly secured her evidence and began researching. She spent her lunch breaks in the base library, studying Air Force regulations on harassment, professional conduct, and communication security protocols. What she discovered changed everything. According to AFI 36-2907, deliberately disabling military communication systems, even during a training exercise, was a serious offense that could result in court-martial. AFI 90-301 required all personnel to report suspected misconduct through proper channels, and most importantly, AFI 36-2706 provided specific protections for whistleblowers reporting misconduct by superior officers. But Becca knew that formal complaints were risky. She needed more than one incident, no matter how serious. She needed a pattern of behavior that couldn't be dismissed as personality conflicts or training issues. She began paying attention to everything Coleman did. She noticed how he assigned the worst details exclusively to junior airmen who couldn't fight back. She documented his habit of scheduling mandatory overtime for people who asked questions during briefings. She recorded instances where he took credit for subordinates' work during squadron meetings. Most importantly, she started talking to other airmen, carefully, quietly, one-on-one. "Hey, Maria," she said to Airman Rivera during a break. "Can I ask you something? That antenna project you designed last month, the one Sergeant Coleman presented to the squadron commander?" Maria's face darkened. "What about it? Did you get any credit for the design work?" "Are you kidding? Coleman told everyone it was his idea. Said I just helped with the paperwork." Maria lowered her voice. "Why? Did something like that happen to you too?" It had. Just the week before, Coleman had submitted Becca's warehouse organization system as his own efficiency improvement proposal. She'd seen her handwritten notes, the ones he'd thrown in the trash, retyped under his name in an official memo to the squadron leadership. One by one, Becca discovered that Coleman's behavior toward her wasn't unique. He'd been bullying, stealing credit from, and retaliating against junior airmen for years. The difference was that most of his previous targets had either transferred to other bases or simply endured the harassment until their enlistments ended. Nobody had ever documented it. Nobody had ever fought back. "You know," Jess Martinez said, during one of their quiet conversations, "there's something you should know about the radio incident." They were alone in the equipment room performing routine maintenance on frequency generators. Jess looked around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I worked late that day, the day you supposedly screwed up the radio calibration. I saw Peterson go back into the radio room after you left. He was in there for about 20 minutes. Becca's hand stilled on the equipment. 20 minutes? The work order showed he left with me. That's what I thought was weird. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he forgot to log something. But? Jess hesitated. I've never seen Peterson care enough about paperwork to go back and fix a log entry. The pieces fell into place. Peterson had sabotaged the radio equipment after Becca left, creating the communications failure that had damaged her reputation. And Coleman had used that manufactured incident to justify treating her as incompetent and dangerous. Jess, Becca said quietly, would you be willing to write down what you saw that day? You mean like a statement? Something like that. Jess was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Then she nodded. Yeah. If you're doing what I think you're doing, then yeah. Someone needs to stop this garbage. That evening, Becca sat in her dorm room with a growing file of evidence. Photographs of deliberate equipment sabotage, documentation of stolen credit for subordinates' work, witness statements about Coleman's pattern of harassment, and copies of Air Force regulations that clearly prohibited his behavior. She also had something else, a copy of Coleman's performance evaluation from the previous year. Jess had quietly provided it, pointing out something interesting. According to his official record, Master Sergeant Coleman was being considered for promotion to Senior Master Sergeant. The promotion board would meet in just 6 weeks. Suddenly, Coleman's escalating harassment made perfect sense. He was trying to eliminate any potential problems before his promotion review. A subordinate filing harassment complaints would reflect poorly on his leadership record. Better to drive problem airmen out of the Air Force entirely than risk them talking to investigators. But Coleman had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Becca was just another quiet, passive victim who would suffer in silence until she gave up and left. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. Becca opened her laptop and began typing her formal complaint to the Inspector General's office. Filing the complaint required courage Becca didn't know she possessed. The Inspector General's office was located in the base headquarters building, surrounded by the offices of colonels and command staff. Walking through those halls in her simple airman's uniform felt like entering enemy territory. "I need to file a formal complaint," she told the administrative sergeant at the IG desk, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of complaint?" "Airman, harassment and misconduct by a superior officer." The sergeant's expression shifted from routine boredom to sharp attention. "Have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Captain Jennifer Hayes, the base's assistant inspector general, was nothing like what Becca had expected. Young, professional, with penetrating eyes that seemed to see everything. She listened without interruption as Becca presented her evidence: photographs, witness statements, documentation of the communications sabotage, records of stolen credit, and retaliatory assignments. "This is thorough work, Airman Walsh," Captain Hayes said finally. "How long did it take you to compile all this?" "About 3 weeks, ma'am." "And during this time, the alleged harassment continued?" "Yes, ma'am. If anything, it got worse." Captain Hayes leaned back in her chair. "You understand that filing this complaint will trigger a formal investigation. Master Sergeant Coleman will be notified that allegations have been made. There may be retaliation attempts." Becca's stomach clenched. "I understand, ma'am." "You also understand that if any of these allegations prove false, you could face disciplinary action yourself?" "Yes, ma'am, but they're not false." Captain Hayes nodded slowly. "I believe you. Airman, the question is whether we can prove it." The investigation began immediately. Within 24 hours, Coleman was called to the IG office for initial questioning. He emerged from the meeting with a thunderous expression and eyes that promised retribution. "Well, well," he said loudly as Becca worked at her desk that afternoon. "Looks like someone's been telling stories." The entire communications center fell silent. Everyone knew what had happened. Gossip traveled fast on a military base. Coleman walked slowly to Becca's workstation, his presence looming over her. "You know what I think about people who can't handle military life, who run crying to mommy when things get tough?" Becca kept her eyes on her computer screen, but her hands were shaking. "I'm just doing my job, Sergeant." "Your job?" Coleman's laugh was ugly. "Your job is to follow orders and keep your mouth shut. Apparently, you need a refresher on both." He reached over and grabbed the maintenance manual she'd been studying. "Since you've got so much free time to write fiction, maybe you need more work to keep you busy. Report to the motor pool tomorrow at 0500. You're on vehicle maintenance duty until further notice." Vehicle maintenance meant working outside in the desert heat, handling engine grease and hydraulic fluid, work that would ruin her uniforms and leave her exhausted. It was punishment disguised as duty assignment, but something had changed in Becca. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something harder and more determined. "Yes, Sergeant," she said calmly. Then she looked up at him directly for the first time in months. "Will that be reflected in a written duty assignment?" Coleman blinked, thrown off by her directness. "What?" "The motor pool assignment. Will you be documenting that in writing for my personnel file?" It was a subtle trap. If Coleman put the punitive assignment in writing, it would create evidence of retaliation. If he didn't, the assignment would be unofficial and potentially challengeable. Just be at the motor pool at 0500, he stammered, then stalked away. After he left, Jess Martinez appeared at Becca's desk. "That was ballsy," she whispered. "That was stupid," Becca replied, but she was smiling for the first time in weeks. Over the following days, Coleman's behavior became increasingly erratic. The investigation was proceeding, and he could feel his control slipping. He assigned Becca to increasingly ridiculous tasks, reorganizing supply closets that didn't need, organizing painting equipment that had been painted the week before, copying documents that were already digitized. But each arbitrary assignment was another piece of evidence for Captain Hayes' investigation. and Coleman's obvious retaliation was undermining his credibility with the investigators. More importantly, other airmen were starting to speak up. Maria Rivera formally reported the stolen credit for her antenna design. 2 airmen from the previous year provided statements about similar harassment they'd endured. Even some of Coleman's supporters began distancing themselves as the investigation gained momentum. The breaking point came during the weekly squadron briefing. Coleman was presenting routine updates when Colonel Patricia Reeves, the squadron commander, asked about the communications efficiency improvements that had been attributed to him. "Tell me about this warehouse organization system, Sergeant Coleman. How did you develop it?" Coleman launched into a detailed explanation of his system, describing organizational principles and efficiency metrics. But as he spoke, his account became increasingly elaborate and contradictory. Finally, Colonel Reeves interrupted. "This is interesting, Sergeant. I'd like to see the original documentation you developed for this system." Coleman's face went pale. The original documentation? Your notes, your planning documents, your efficiency calculations? I assume you kept records of your development process?" From her seat in the back of the briefing room, Becca watched Coleman struggle to answer. She had kept meticulous records. They were sitting in her dorm room, handwritten in her own, careful script, documents that would prove conclusively who had really developed the system. Coleman mumbled something about needing to locate the files, and Colonel Reeves moved on to other topics. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had witnessed a senior NCO unable to explain his own supposed work. After the briefing, Captain Hayes approached Becca in the hallway. "Airman Walsh, I think we need to have another conversation." The formal hearing was held in the base conference room, with Colonel Reeves presiding. Present were Captain Hayes as the investigating officer, Master Sergeant Coleman, Becca, and a court reporter to document everything officially. Coleman sat rigid in his dress blue uniform, his ribbons and stripes perfect, but his face drawn with stress. The past 2 weeks of investigation had taken their toll. 3 more airmen had come forward with harassment complaints. The communications sabotage evidence was damning. His promotion to senior master sergeant had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome. This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to support allegations of harassment, misconduct, and sabotage against Master Sergeant Derek Coleman, Colonel Reeves announced. "Captain Hayes, present your findings." Captain Hayes stood with a thick folder of evidence. "Ma'am, the investigation has revealed a pattern of harassment, retaliation, and misconduct spanning approximately 18 months. The evidence includes documented sabotage of military communications equipment, theft of intellectual property from subordinates, and systematic harassment designed to force junior airmen out of the service." She presented the evidence methodically, photographs of the deliberately disabled communication systems, witness statements from multiple airmen, documentation of stolen credit for subordinates' work, and records of retaliatory job assignments. The investigation also revealed that Master Sergeant Coleman has been falsifying duty rosters to cover up his sabotage activities, and has been coaching Airman Peterson to provide false statements supporting his narratives. Coleman's face went from pale to red. "Colonel, this is ridiculous. You're taking the word of a washout airman who can't handle military discipline over a 22-year veteran with an exemplary record." "Master Sergeant," Colonel Reeves said coldly, "you'll have your opportunity to respond." Captain Hayes, continue. The presentation continued for nearly an hour. Each piece of evidence built on the others, creating an undeniable picture of systematic abuse of authority. Coleman's supporters on the base had gradually distanced themselves as the investigation revealed the extent of his misconduct. Finally, Captain Hayes concluded, "Ma'am, I recommend that Master Sergeant Coleman face formal court-martial proceedings for sabotage of military communication systems, harassment of subordinates, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer." Colonel Reeves turned to Coleman. "Master Sergeant, respond to these allegations." Coleman stood, his jaw clenched. "Ma'am, I've served this Air Force faithfully for over 2 decades. I've deployed 6 times, received commendations for my technical expertise, and trained dozens of junior airmen. This investigation is based on the complaints of a few malcontents who can't handle real military standards." He pointed at Becca. "Airman Walsh has been a problem since day one. She's caused communications failures, she can't follow simple orders, and now she's trying to destroy my career with fabricated complaints. The evidence against me was planted or manipulated. Are you suggesting that Airman Walsh somehow disabled communication systems herself to frame you? Coleman hesitated. The logistics of such a conspiracy would be nearly impossible for a junior airman to execute. I'm saying the evidence isn't reliable. What about the witness statements from Senior Airman Martinez and others? They're her friends. They're covering for her. Colonel Reeves leaned forward. Master Sergeant, are you claiming that multiple airmen, including personnel with unblemished records, have conspired to frame you? Coleman's composure finally cracked. I'm claiming that some people can't handle military discipline. Walsh is weak, she's always been weak, and instead of improving herself, she decided to destroy someone who tried to make her better. The room fell silent. Coleman's outburst had revealed exactly the attitude that had driven his harassment campaign. Colonel Reeves turned to Becca. Airman Walsh, do you have anything to add? Becca stood slowly. For months, she'd been the quiet victim, absorbing Coleman's harassment while planning her response. Now, finally, she had the chance to speak her truth. Ma'am, I joined the Air Force because I wanted to serve my country. I expected military discipline. I expected high standards. What I didn't expect was a senior NCO who would sabotage military operations to settle personal grudges. Her voice was steady, professional, but underneath was steel that hadn't been there months earlier. Master Sergeant Coleman didn't try to make me better. He tried to break me. He sabotaged equipment and blamed me for the failures. He stole credit for my work. He assigned punitive duties designed to force me out of the service, and when I finally reported his misconduct, he retaliated by trying to destroy my career completely. She looked directly at Coleman for the first time during the hearing. But he made one mistake. He assumed I would stay quiet and take it. He assumed I was too weak to fight back. He was wrong. Colonel Reeves nodded slowly. Thank you, Airman Walsh. The hearing concluded with Colonel Reeves announcing that the case would be forwarded to the base legal office for formal court-martial proceedings. Coleman was immediately relieved of his supervisory duties and restricted to base pending trial. As the participants filed out of the conference room, Coleman stopped beside Becca's chair. This isn't over, he whispered. Yes, Becca replied. Quietly. It is. Master Sergeant Derek Coleman's court-martial lasted 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming and additional witnesses came forward once they realized they could safely speak. He was convicted on charges of sabotaging military communications, harassment of subordinates, and conduct unbecoming an NCO. His sentence was reduction in rank to staff sergeant, forfeiture of 2 months' pay, and discharge from the Air Force, with an other-than-honorable characterization. His 22-year career ended in disgrace, his retirement benefits reduced, his promotion to senior master sergeant permanently canceled. Airman Peterson, who had participated in the equipment sabotage, received non-judicial punishment and was transferred to another base. For Becca, the immediate aftermath was surreal. Suddenly, the same airmen who had avoided her for months were treating her with something approaching respect. Not because she was popular, she was still the quiet, bookish girl from Nebraska, but because she had proven something important about herself. You know, Jess Martinez said as they worked together on routine maintenance, you could probably get revenge assignments for anyone who gave you trouble during Coleman's reign of terror. Becca looked up from the frequency calibrator she was adjusting. Why would I want to do that? I don't know. Payback, justice, human nature. This was never about payback, Becca replied. It was about stopping someone who was hurting people and damaging the mission. Getting revenge would make me just like him. Jess smiled. That's what I figured you'd say. It's why what you did mattered. The communications squadron under new leadership became a different place. Staff Sergeant Williams, Coleman's replacement, was a quiet professional who focused on training and mission accomplishment rather than intimidation. Junior airmen were encouraged to contribute ideas and ask questions. The warehouse organization system that Becca had developed was finally implemented squadron-wide, saving hundreds of hours of maintenance time. Becca herself began to emerge from her shell, not dramatically, She was still the quiet, studious airman who preferred technical manuals to small talk, but she carried herself differently now, with confidence earned through adversity. When new airmen joined the squadron, she made sure they felt welcomed and supported. 6 months after Coleman's court-martial, Colonel Reeves called Becca to her office. "Airman Walsh, I have some news. Your promotion to senior airman has been accelerated due to your exceptional performance and leadership during the Coleman investigation. Additionally, you've been selected for early admission to the Airman Leadership School." Becca blinked in surprise. Both the promotion and the leadership school were significant career milestones, typically reserved for airmen with longer service records. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm ready for leadership responsibilities." Colonel Reeves smiled. "Airman, you've already demonstrated more real leadership than many NCOs with decades of experience. Leadership isn't about rank or authority, it's about doing the right thing when it's difficult and protecting those who can't protect themselves. You've already proven you understand that." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "What you did took tremendous courage. You could have kept quiet, served out your enlistment, and avoided all the drama. Instead, you chose to fight for justice, even when the odds were against you. That's the kind of person we need developing into our future NCO Corps." As Becca walked back to the communications center, she reflected on how much had changed. The scared, uncertain girl who had arrived at Nellis 8 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone harder and more confident. Someone who had learned that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud intimidation. The other airmen in the squadron looked at her differently now, not with the casual dismissal she'd endured under Coleman, but with genuine respect. They knew she was someone who would stand up for what was right, even when it was costly. But perhaps most importantly, Becca had learned something about herself. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, strong enough to endure harassment, smart enough to build a case for justice, and brave enough to confront a corrupt authority figure who had seemed untouchable. The quiet girl from Nebraska had found her voice, and when she spoke, people listened. 2 years later, Staff Sergeant Rebecca Walsh stood in the same communications center where she'd once been humiliated and harassed. But everything was different now. She wore the 3 stripes of a staff sergeant with quiet pride, having been promoted ahead of her peers due to her technical expertise and leadership abilities. The Airman Leadership School had transformed her from someone who endured authority to someone who wielded it responsibly. Her subordinates respected her not because they feared her, but because she genuinely cared about their development and welfare. The warehouse organization system she'd developed had been adopted by 3 other squadrons and was being considered for base-wide implementation. She'd received commendations for her technical innovations and had been selected for cross-training. In advanced communication systems, her career was thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. But the most meaningful change wasn't in her rank or responsibilities, it was in the culture of the communications squadron. "Sergeant Walsh," called Airman Bradley, a nervous young man from Ohio who reminded her of herself 2 years earlier. "Can you help me understand this frequency calibration procedure? I'm having trouble with the calculations." "Of course," Becca replied, walking over to his workstation. "Let's work through it together." She spent 20 minutes patiently explaining the technical concepts, making sure Bradley understood not just the procedure, but the reasoning behind it. When he made a mistake, she corrected it gently, without humiliation or sarcasm. "Thanks, Sergeant," Bradley said when they finished. "I was afraid to ask anyone else. I didn't want to look stupid." "There are no stupid questions," Becca replied. "The only mistake is not asking when you need help." It was a philosophy that had transformed the squadron. Under her influence and that of other leaders who had learned from the Coleman scandal, the communications center had become a place where junior airmen could ask questions, contribute ideas, and make mistakes without fear of retaliation. That evening, Becca sat in her off-base apartment, a small but comfortable place she'd been able to afford since her promotion, writing in the journal she'd kept since the Coleman investigation began. It had started as documentation for her complaint, but had evolved into a record of her growth and reflections on leadership. "Airman Bradley today reminded me of myself when I first arrived," she wrote. scared, uncertain, trying so hard to fit in that he was afraid to admit when he needed help. I remember what it felt like to be dismissed and humiliated for asking questions. I never want anyone in my squadron to feel that way. She paused, thinking about the ripple effects of her decision to stand up to Coleman. 3 other airmen had been inspired to report harassment they'd suffered at previous assignments. The base had implemented new training programs on preventing abuse of authority. Several senior NCOs had been quietly counseled about their leadership styles after the Coleman court-martial sent shockwaves through the command structure. I used to think courage meant not being afraid, she continued writing. Now I know courage means being afraid, but doing the right thing anyway. Coleman taught me something important, though he didn't mean to. Bullies rely on their victims staying silent. The moment you find your voice, their power disappears. A knock at her door interrupted her writing. She opened it to find Senior Airman Martinez, now cross-training for her own promotion to Staff Sergeant. "Hey, Becca, got a minute?" "Always. What's up?" Jess held up an official-looking document. "Remember that airman I told you about at Davis Monthan? The one having trouble with her flight chief?" Becca nodded. Jess had mentioned a friend at another base who was experiencing harassment, similar to what Becca had endured under Coleman. She filed a complaint with the IG office. "Used your case as a template for documenting everything." Jess smiled. "Her flight chief just got relieved of duty pending investigation. She wanted me to thank you." "She doesn't need to thank me. She did the hard work herself." "Yeah, but you showed her it was possible. You showed all of us it was possible." After Jess left, Becca returned to her journal. "I never wanted to be a symbol or an inspiration. I just wanted to do my job and be left alone. But I'm learning that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you. Coleman targeted me because he thought I was weak and isolated. He was half right. I was isolated. But I wasn't weak. I just hadn't learned how strong I could be." She thought about the young airmen currently serving at bases around the world, dealing with their own versions of Coleman. Some would endure in silence, others would find the courage to speak up, and gradually the culture would change, one complaint, one investigation, one court-martial at a time. The Air Force taught me about duty, honor, and service, but it was Coleman who taught me about justice, not the kind that comes from above, but the kind you have to fight for yourself. The kind that requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the situation demands it. She closed the journal and looked at the framed photo on her desk, herself with her parents at her promotion ceremony 6 months earlier. They'd flown out from Nebraska, beaming with pride as she'd pinned on her new stripes. Her mother had cried, remembering the scared girl who'd worried about washing out of basic training. "I'm proud of you," her father had said quietly, "not because of the promotion, but because of who you've become." Who had she become? Still the quiet girl from Nebraska who preferred technical manuals to parties. Still someone who chose her words carefully and avoided unnecessary conflict. But underneath the surface, there was something new, unshakable confidence in her own worth and an absolute commitment to protecting others from the kind of abuse she'd endured. The next morning brought routine duties, equipment maintenance, personnel training, administrative tasks. Becca went about her work with the same methodical precision she'd always possessed, but now her subordinates came to her with questions and problems without hesitation. They knew she would listen, help them find solutions, and never use their vulnerabilities against them. During the afternoon briefing, Colonel Reeves announced that Becca had been selected for assignment to the Pentagon's Communications Directorate, a career-enhancing position typically reserved for the Air Force's most promising technical experts. "Staff Sergeant Walsh," the colonel said, "you'll be working on policy development for military communication systems. Your insights on equipment efficiency and personnel management will be valuable at the headquarters level." After the briefing, several airmen congratulated her on the assignment. It was a recognition that her technical skills and leadership abilities had earned her a place among the Air Force's rising stars. But the comment that meant the most came from Airman Bradley. "Sergeant Walsh," he said quietly, "when I get promoted someday, I want to be the kind of NCO you are. Fair, patient, and willing to stand up for people." Becca smiled. Then you will be, Bradley. You will be. As she walked back to her workstation, Becca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years ago, she'd been a scared, isolated airman who seemed destined to wash out of the military. Coleman had seen her as an easy target, someone who would absorb his abuse and eventually disappear. He'd been spectacularly wrong. The quiet girl from Nebraska hadn't just survived, she'd thrived. More importantly, she'd proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they found the courage to stand up for what was right. And in the process, she'd helped change the culture of military leadership, one conversation and one courageous decision at a time. The legacy wasn't in her promotions or commendations. It was in the knowledge that junior airmen like Bradley could ask questions without fear, that bullies like Coleman could no longer operate with impunity, and that quiet strength, properly applied, could move mountains. Coleman had tried to break her. Instead, he'd forged her into exactly the kind of leader the Air Force needed. That, Becca thought as she returned to her technical manuals, was justice served cold. Author's note: this story is dedicated to all the quiet, underestimated people who find the courage to speak truth to power. Your voices matter. Your strength inspires others. And sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have your own story of standing up to workplace bullies or military injustice? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else to find their voice and fight back against unfair treatment. Next week, we'll be sharing the story of the janitor who exposed $1 million scam, another tale of an underestimated person who proved that quiet observation and careful documentation can bring down even the most powerful, corrupt officials. Thank you for being part of our community, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power when they finally choose to speak.